Hello and welcome to Newswire. I am Munib. Hamid. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us fix our focus to a much larger, multifaceted humanitarian crisis throughout the country. Violence, displacement, drought and the COVID-19 pandemic hit the Afghan population with accelerating force. Now, the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution also on this, calling for enhanced humanitarian assistance. Making that happen will require an urgent increase in donor funding, easing of sanctions, regional cooperation on air bridges for aid delivery, and perhaps most difficult, persistent attention from the Western governments that may prefer to move on from defeat in Afghanistan. Donors and aid organizations will be confronted with wrenching decisions in the coming weeks as they are called upon to answer the UN's flash appeal, while also being disquieted by the Taliban's new de facto authority, I beg your pardon. Now, in the interest of preventing a human catastrophe that reverberates throughout South and Central Asia, donors will need to set aside their concern about the Taliban, at least for the narrow purpose of ensuring that aid reaches the Afghan population and refugees living nearby. Now, so we are going to be discussing the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and we have with us Lisa Camillo. She is an anthropologist and a film director. Welcome, Lisa. And with
Hello.
Lisa, we have Dr. Usman Chohan, Director of the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Now, I am going to start with Lisa, you now. Lisa, 1/3 of Afghanistan's population, 38 million people are facing food insecurity, including 2 million children who are already malnourished, according to the World Food Programme.
It's a huge crisis. It's incredibly worrying what's happening over there right now. And we're going to have already tens of thousands of Afghanistan leaving and fleeing the country. And we have to be ready to welcome them and have also infrastructures to assist them in learning the language of the new country they're living in, helping them with occupation, so finding a profession and housing, of course. So yeah, we're facing a huge refugees crisis all over the world.
Right now, Usman, let's come to you now. We have unprecedented numbers of civilians killed and injured in the early months of 2021, and at least the number we have right now is 560,000 people were only displaced now, including 120,000 fleeing to Kabul as they sought refuge from the Taliban advances now. Now, Usman, those numbers represents the worst ever period in what for some years has been the world's deadliest conflict. Now, what can we expect more?
I think that going forward, there's two paths for Afghanistan. One is positive and stable, and the other one involves a great deal of instability, not just for Afghanistan itself, but for the region. And the choices that we make as policymakers in the region, including Pakistan and its partners, China, Russia, and other stakeholders, assist Afghanistan, then something is possible in terms of development, in terms of stabilizing the fiscal and monetary policy of the country, and in terms of getting the flow of goods and services going, circulation of cash in the economy. All those important factors require a multi-stakeholder effort. Otherwise, things could get very bad very quickly.
Right, Lisa, let's talk about a documentary also making the Belantes, and now you also talked about about wars and what they leave behind in terms of nanoparticles from using weapons containing depleted uranium and other radioactive materials. So tell us with that reference about Afghanistan, if you may.
Yes, of course. My documentary is about what's happening in Italy, in Sardinia. We have the biggest military areas in the world, at least in Europe. 60% of the main armies, the biggest nations, for example, the US, France, England, and so forth, the one that belong to NATO are training in Italy here in these military bases. And what we found in these military bases, that soldiers and people living around the areas started dying of cancers, really strange cancers, sudden, in a country where we actually have the longest living people in the world, Sardinia. So I started researching what's been happening, why in these particular areas people are dying. And the things that emerged, which now it's been talked in a court case against the Italian Defense Force, is that they're using weapons that contain these illegal substances like depleted uranium and thorium. They are incredibly carcinogenic because they create nanoparticles. So I found that the same strange deaths have been happening in countries of Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere where these countries are having wars. So the problem with these substances, they are radioactive, that they stay radioactive for thousands of years. And what happens, it also impacts the birth of children. So a lot of children that have contacts with these substances, they they die of leukemia very early on, or what happens is pregnancies are actually have malformations. So its generation will be impacted in Afghanistan, unfortunately, because of these substances that the US has left behind. So it's incredibly alarming what we're going to see in the future in a place where we're not going to have proper health care.
Right, and you have said that you believe that the same is happening in Afghanistan now. Usman, the UN reports that hospitals are overflowing in Afghanistan, medical supplies are dwindling, and critical infrastructure has been damaged or completely destroyed. Now, we know essential food supplies in many cities are running short as well. What does the Taliban need to do to counter all these?
The important thing to understand is that Afghanistan's economy, even under the previous government, was not a self-sustaining economy. It was being run by foreign aid. So 75% of their $5.5 billion-ish budget before was basically foreign aid. And what has dried up is the foreign aid in the fiscal space. So their fiscal space has suddenly shrunk in the abstract, but also their institutions are largely closed. So what does the Afghan Central Bank do when it's $10 billion-ish of reserves held in the U.S. banking system are not dispersed to it? What does it do when the IMF does not send the special drawing rights that it already owes and the new issuance doesn't go to them? And then more importantly, what happens when the banking system within Afghanistan remains shuttered? Now, I know that some banks have started to open up in the major cities, but you're not seeing a circulation of cash outside. So what happens is there are long lines in front of the banks and only limited amounts of withdrawals are allowed. And so because of that, people aren't able to get the cash they need in a cash-driven society. What is happening because of that is that people are not able to purchase the essential items. And so food inflation over the last 10 days has gone up by about 50%. And the reason that that is so is that in terms of, that's the demand side, but the supply side is that a lot of their foods and from neighboring countries, particularly Pakistan, is a big import and export partner. In the previous government, it was about 20% of their imports and exports. Pakistan needs to get these somehow into Afghanistan to get the food prices down, people being able to consume and so forth. But it isn't easy in these circumstances. So the Taliban then has to make sure that it is able to work out a deal so that the reserves abroad, the banks domestically, and the trade routes, so all three aspects are meant to circulate again or transfer again for the benefit of the Afghan people.
Right, Usman, as you said, the prices have gone up 50%, and just to add, the fuel prices are up by 75% as well. Now, Lisa, access to cash in the country is limited. We know that. They have frozen assets. Now, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have already frozen their funds now. It remains uncertain how the United States will continue to supply foreign assistance to the Afghans.
That's right. You have to wonder where the cash is going to come from in the future, where jobs are going to be, or people going to be driven to. One thing that we could think is that that could drive people into the opium trade, for example, and having such a strong country and such an export of opium, therefore heroin, we might face a world heroin crisis, perhaps in the future, because we're going to have huge a supply of heroin in the world from the next few years, perhaps.
Right now, Usman, let's talk about the Taliban's coming regime and having professionals for specific institutions, organizations. Obviously, you need professions to run the government. Obviously, the Taliban have been good in military. They have proven the mettle. But when it comes to running a government, not having enough people in the professional positions like doctors, teachers, accountants will impoverish the country even more, making it more unstable and poor.
Yes, I think you're touching on a very important point. The most important form of capital that Afghanistan may need in the longer run is not financial capital, it is human capital. Investments in human capital were very limited even in the previous government. Yes, they opened up universities, yes, they did a lot of stuff, but in terms of training the technocrats, not a lot was being done. And a lot of the people that were placed who were Afghans in the previous government had lived abroad but didn't necessarily have human capital. They were probably working class in the United States, and so not particularly stellar in terms of their technocratic expertise. Afghanistan has always faced this problem, but it's extremely dire now. So what the Taliban is saying now is that these bureaucrats, civil servants at all levels should come back to work. But it's not said anything about paying them. And for the past few months, perhaps 3, 4, 5 months, civil servants have not been receiving their salaries anyways. So it's very hard for civil servants to be persuaded to come for a 6th month of work without a salary. And so things are getting very rough and tumble. But even if they did return to work, it doesn't mean that they can solve these complex problems of a distressed society quickly. That requires external interventions that are positive and take the Afghan people on board, as well as the regional partners. This is not up to the Afghan people themselves. They simply don't have the capacity. And then the problem is that the risks that emerge from that situation can spill over into neighboring countries. Ma'am Lisa mentioned opium, but we also have to worry about the refugee crisis that could come to Pakistan, for example, and that could get very bad as well. So the Taliban having the right people to run the peacetime conditions, that doesn't seem to be on the cards.
Right, and you talked about the refugee crisis, and we know for a fact, Lisa, for decades, millions of Afghans have escaped the crisis by seeking refuge abroad, mostly neighboring Pakistan and Iran. Now, the latest disaster, however, has struck at a time when other countries are increasingly shutting their doors to the Afghans now. Don't you think, like, for example, not having enough people, if the Afghan refugees are not allowed in the other countries, is going to create another crisis internally, of course. And also, and if the countries are not prepared enough to accept Afghan refugees, this will bring further racism and maybe Islamophobia and the rise of the extreme right in the countries, criminally and violently.
Yeah, this is incredibly scary thought. It's already been happening, unfortunately, in the last decades, this Islamophobia, and this also rise in the extreme right. Which is something that we all have to worry about. Unfortunately, if we don't welcome refugees appropriately, as I said, teaching them the language, giving a profession, giving them access to school, to medication, to healthcare, to housing, desperate people, unfortunately, they do desperate things. So it's normal that poverty would drive people also to criminality. And it's going to be easier and easier for the right to unfortunately blame anything that would be criminality onto, refugees and the outsider, the scared of the outsider, unfortunately.
Right.
So we have to be incredibly prepared.
Yeah, exactly, Lisa. Now, Usman, there is some good news, like Brussels is drafting a proposal for a £600 million European Union package for Afghanistan's neighbours to accept refugees as it tries to avoid a repeat of the 2015 Syrian migrant crisis. Do you see this proposal going ahead?
I take it with a significant dose of skepticism, because these 600 million is a very small amount compared to the social costs and economic costs that neighbors have to pay. Different people have tried to cost the size of the toll that Pakistan's economy took after 2001, after 1979, and the numbers go into the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. That is because of the incompatibility of the Afghan refugees with Pakistan's labor market. So they're basically taking jobs from the people here, as opposed to Syrians going to Germany, where they were highly skilled, ready to start a new life, and Germany had a labor deficit. Pakistan doesn't have a labor deficit. It actually needs to create 2 to 3 million jobs a year, Pakistan itself, for its own people. In addition, there's a bad aftertaste from the legacy of Afghan refugees in cities such as Peshawar. So the local governments there are not too excited about these people coming over. So 600 million is a very small bribe, a very small compensation to pay. And I think that what we really need is a model where people in Afghanistan are kept safe in their own country because of the right-wing issues that Ma'am Lisa mentioned, but here also in terms of the economic toll.
Right, Lisa, let's talk about the Afghan people now. We know they have been living, they have seen, the generations have seen war. And now, since we can say there is no war in Afghanistan after all the foreign teams have gone out of Afghanistan now, how important and how can the Afghan people start living a normal life all of a sudden?
I think it's going to take a long time to recover, especially because of trauma. I think trauma is going to, psychological trauma is going to take a huge toll. And if we don't have healthcare, a strong healthcare to protect these people and get them back into a normal life, functioning life, is going to be hard. And especially, of course, I'm going to mention women because I'm a woman. I'm a filmmaker. So, for example, if I would be living there, I wouldn't have a voice at all. I probably would. In the past, the Taliban has shown to capture journalists and torture them and kill them. So it would be incredibly hard to get back into a sort of normal life. But I really hope that this new Taliban 2.0 is going to actually be a little bit more open, especially towards women, to welcome them back into society and in job positions of power.
We certainly hope that too, Lisa. Now, Usman, the Taliban 2.0, as Lisa said here, it's not yet being accepted by the international bodies, international institutions. As we know, the Taliban will also be constrained by their finances, and there doesn't seem to be any ease coming their way any sooner. And under the previous government, 75% of the public spending was funded by donors, as you said also, and a resource stream that is now at least indefinitely suspended now. As you also mentioned earlier, salaries for doctors, teachers and other workers are in jeopardy, and adds is the ability to finance the imports in heavily import-dependent economy. Now, after the US froze nearly all the central bank's $9.4 billion reserves, and also under the pressure from Biden administration, the International Monetary World Bank Fund also followed suit by blocking access to the emergency reserves of $460 million, and the World Bank suspended all its projects in Afghanistan. The European Union suspended $1.2 billion, while in development assistance planned for Afghanistan over the next decade, pending talks with the Taliban. Now, where do you think this money is going to be given to the Taliban anytime sooner? Because this is a very big amount, and if the world wants to see a prosperous and developed Afghanistan, I guess this is a key point here.
I agree with you. I believe that Pakistan has an important role to play as a mediator in terms of getting capital back into Afghanistan so that the stability stays there. It has to be Pakistan in concert with other major regional partners, including China and Russia, doing this. But keep in mind, this is an interesting point, that the de facto currency in Afghanistan for the past 40 years has been the Pakistan rupee. But Pakistan can actually do a lot more than is immediately visible in terms of getting circulation of cash in their economy, since it is our currency that has been used there. There are a lot of creative ways to do this that respect Afghanistan's sovereignty and assist the Afghan people, but we need to wait this out and yet act quickly. That's the dilemma. You have to wait this out to see how the international committees deal with this, but you also need to intercede so that the desperation doesn't increase in the cities. And there are no easy fixes on that point.
Right, Usman, we also have another problem with that. Obviously, as you said, Afghans, they are using Pakistan's currency right there. But do you think the international, community is going to allow that in the future?
It's hard to say. So, for example, the Afghan currency, the Afghani, has devalued, is beginning to devalue significantly. But that is actually a very worrisome thing because they're an import-dependent economy. In terms of getting funds back there, either it is the Taliban that the international community recognizes, or it is a provisional government that has multiple stakeholders. Ideally, that would be the way to go. The Taliban seems to show that it wants to negotiate with others, but negotiations are also starting to break down. So it's not clear how a unified Afghan voice could be articulated, and yet the desperation of people increases by the day.
Right, Lisa, let's come back to the Afghans now. Tell me how the Taliban can improve the livelihoods of the Afghan women, children.
Well, have them, of course, leaving them in the jobs. For example, as soon as they took over Kabul, they fired 600 female journalists, for example. And so leaving only 100 journalists left, that's shocking. Also, allowing a voice, allowing people to talk, like journalists, to really show the world what's happening, and being able also to criticize, because these sort of regimes won't allow any criticism that, leaving the country. They really try to control the world opinion, and they're really trying to show the world that they're new Talibans, they're a new version of them. So they're going to be very careful of what the information is going to come out. And of course, another important point, I think it's also trying to keep up with vaccinations, COVID vaccinations, because as soon as Kabul fell in the hands of the Taliban, unfortunately, vaccinations fell down to 80%. And let's remind that only 2% of Afghan people are actually vaccinated. So new variants are coming through in the world. So we have to be very careful that that side is not going out of control in Afghanistan.
Right, and we certainly hope that. Now, Usman, how can donor states and international organizations help Taliban 2.0?
The first is to release the assets that are held in the U.S. banking system if they recognize it as a legitimate government, because a 10 billion stimulus would be a very big deal for an economy that is in tatters. The second is that the IMF, as a lender of last resort to sovereign countries, release the new SDRs as well as the existing $500 million of SDRs. Those get channeled via the Afghan Central Bank for their immediate purchases. They can convert the SDRs into other currencies. And the third is that if there's enough stability, that the trucks start going back into Afghanistan with the goods from here to reduce the costs of food. And they can be deferred payment for that. They can be denominated in various trade credit facilities. I mean, there's plenty of ways to do that. But I don't count necessarily on the donor community's sympathies, because the political backlash is very significant in the West, and they're still reeling for it and making it a domestic issue in their politics. For example, in Congress, Republicans are blaming Democrats and vice versa, and there seems to be little political will to continue this. They really want to sever this, close this chapter definitely, and that's very worrying.
Rightly said by Usman, and we still have Lisa and Usman here with us, and we are talking about Afghanistan's economic and humanitarian crisis. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. I am Munib. Hamid. We have with us Lisa Camillo, anthropologist and a film director, and we also have with us Dr. Usman Chohan, director of the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Now, Lisa, the Taliban's technical capacity to address the challenges forward are very challenging to them, and it doesn't seem like they do have a team to take care of those challenges. What do you think about it?
So, well, it's going to be, I don't know how much experience they have to actually running a whole country. Also cutting a big portion of the population, which is the female population, out of the government is going to pose also a challenge. Also is going to, they really do have to tackle the coronavirus crisis, which they have absolutely no experience whatsoever. They would have to yeah, it's going to be quite challenging for them. Absolutely.
Right, it is going to be a challenge. Now, there's another challenge and rather an advantage to the Taliban, Usman, that might bring to their economic stewardship as a reputation of being less corrupt than their predecessors.
You've mentioned a very important point here. In fact, this is something that isn't given enough attention, but the Taliban have a much stronger reputation of being speedy in their justice, even though it's oftentimes very cruel. And that's their single party platform. And they have shown that through extreme judgments. Part of that is also to fight corruption and curb the drug trade. They did very well on these fronts, and they aren't given enough credit for that because of other faults that they had. Now, in terms of keeping a clean government, it is very important, and this is in fact the main reason why the previous government did not succeed and its army capitulated quickly, was that they were basically taking paychecks, but they weren't interested in keeping a clean government. Because that means that there's vested stakeholders and there's elite capture and different problems in society that emerged. And so Taliban can be a strong counter voice in that regard by bringing all of Afghanistan together and trying to run a clean government with tough accountability, which is definitely a strength of theirs. You're right.
Right. Now, Lisa, talking about the humanitarian side, and obviously, as we've already talked about this earlier before we went on to the break now, that the Afghans have only seen war. Now, understanding the new regime, coping with the new regime, and living a normal life with the new regime is going to be very difficult. Now, speaking from the Taliban's perspective, when they come into power, when they form a government, do you think, and what suggestions you might give to the coming government on how they might tackle the Afghan problems from the grassroots level when it comes to humanitarian assistance, psychological assistance, the trauma? How can the Taliban help their people get out of it?
I think it's important perhaps to allow foreign aid to come in the country, and those who really have experience in aid and assistance, like, Save the Children and organizations like that, which do incredibly great work, and they have the experience of what to do. So I think trusting a little bit the foreign aid is going to be very important, and put that trust into practice. We really need to develop a lot of emergency aid for the most poor, the most displaced. There are still thousands displaced in Afghanistan, even before the Taliban came to Kabul. So I think they really need a little bit the foreigners, which, understandably they don't, as happened in history for them. So,
well, it's the foreigners who do not trust the Afghan people. I'd repeat that, because we've seen the Afghans fighting for Afghanistan, and the only demand that the Afghans have had, that we do not want any foreign troops on our land, and we just want to live according to our culture. Now, Usman, tell us, and the audience, how rich is the poorest country, one of the poorest countries in the world? How rich is it?
Well, this is an extremely important question. It is an extremely rich country with an enormous potential. We can't even imagine how much natural resource wealth lies beneath their surface, which has yet to be exploited for their benefit. It's supposed to be above $1 trillion, but it could be far larger, since we haven't done the geographical assessments, the geological surveys. And that sort of mineral wealth basically has been a strategic reserve that they've never exploited. For Americans, it could have been something if they had created a clean and inclusive government, that they could then profit from that. War profiteering has been a big part of that system. But instead now, Taliban's most recent announcements suggest that they expect China to assist in this much strongly. And China has a much larger vision in terms of its One Belt, One Road, which includes CPEC, the Pakistani component of that, integrated with Afghanistan, and then made possible to extract whatever wealth in an equitable way that benefits the Afghan people, including giving them fiscal space for public expenditure. That is all possible, but it won't be under the stewardship of an American government or a Western one or backed by them. Instead, China has gained far more space politically to continue to expand the vision of its One Belt, One Road, with a central component being Afghanistan in terms of the arteries of the BRI.
Right, Usman, to continue on this, obviously natural resources and the extraction is very important. But do you see that happening in the near future, or is it going to take some time?
Well, you'd be surprised how quickly China has managed to lay down the rudiments of its infrastructure across countries. So CPEC was officially begun in announced in 2013, really begun in 2015, and already so much development has occurred in Pakistan, which has had enormous benefits. In fact, we are now already halfway through phase 2 of CPEC. And if Pakistan has not gained more from CPEC, it is because its private sector has not been ready psychologically to benefit from what is possible. We're very fortunate in Pakistan to have these opportunities now. And Afghanistan could also therefore see a quick development as long as the security situation doesn't explode. Chinese engineers have faced risks in many countries, and they will certainly face them or doctors or other technocrats will face such risks in Afghanistan, but as long as their security can be assured, you would be surprised how quickly things can get done. So I'm thinking of a 5-year scale. So by 2026, starting now, if they work together, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China, you can see an incredible amount of development in terms of infrastructure and other essentials, including power, electricity, their dry ports, ready to go. And 5 years is not a long time. They've seen 40 years of war, after all.
And 5 years seems quite less time for me when we're talking about China doing the development projects. We've seen China, how speedily they work. Lisa, what do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, it makes sense that Chinese is one of the biggest producers of technology. So they do need minerals, which Afghanistan is incredibly rich. So it would be a beautiful marriage, I guess, and would definitely speed up the economic development of Afghanistan.
Right, Usman, let's talk about internal and external threats now, which is also very important for the prosperity of Afghanistan. Now, when we are talking about that the poorest country is one of the richest countries in the world, so we also know for a fact that there are certain countries who do not want to see Afghanistan become the richest country.
Precisely right. You mentioned two dimensions, the internal and the external. And on the internal front, we also have to cover the fractured nature of ethnic relations in that country. Unlike many countries, including Pakistan, there is no core population of Afghans. The Pashtuns were excluded largely from the previous government, even though the head of the government was a Pashtun. And so do you have Darris, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Pashtuns? How do you get them together? That's an important internal dimension. The external is that there are countries that would not like to see Afghanistan prosper. I don't need to name the names. You're familiar with who they are. And in Pakistan's interest is actually the converse, that we need it to succeed. If we have a stable Afghanistan, we can assure a stable Pakistan as well, because the integration, trade, migration, and other factors, so human movement rather than refugees, is a very important factor that can help both countries to prosper together. But it isn't the same point of view with all countries, and that is the exogenous risk that Afghanistan now faces, always has faced, in fact.
Right, Lisa, you heard what Usman said. Now, for a fact, I'm sure even you know that the Afghanistan war was favored and was not really appreciated by many countries now. And also about when these troops left the country. Now, we know for a fact certain countries, neighbors who do not want to see peace, and they have been, promoting a negativity in the society. We were talking to our correspondent yesterday, and she was informing us that for the last 2 decades in Afghanistan, so because India was in control, because the Kabul government was pro-Indian now, they were introducing and teaching syllabus to their children about how to hate Pakistan and how to hate Taliban, as they were portraying as a monstrous image. Now, what do the neighbors need to do for the prosperity of Afghanistan?
That's a very good question.
Maybe they just need to start promoting peace in Afghanistan instead of,
hate, for sure. That's the obvious answer, for sure. Definitely, that's very important. And the fact that Afghanistan is for and from Afghanistan people, not for Americans, not for other armies to invade, and that's very important. Mind your own business, and Afghanistan need to develop its own culture, its own identity, and incorporating all facets of its culture. And that's very, very important to respect that.
Right, so Usman, the countries who do not want to see peace in Afghanistan need to mind their own business now. What's your comment on this?
They certainly do. In fact, they're being forced to mind their own business. They're being forced to the negotiating table with the new government, whether they like it or not. But interestingly, in the neighbors that have sowed chaos in Afghanistan and promoted hate against Pakistan in Afghanistan, those countries have actually used, that country has actually used this occasion of the Taliban rising to power as an occasion to brutalize its Muslim minority. The Twitter feeds and all of this, as well as state governments in the south and in the north of India, are using this as an example of Talibanization as an iconography to attack their own communities, which have already suffered a great deal under the current government. And so this has become a pretext to brutalize their own minority for domestic political capital, which is really terrible.
Right, Lisa, again, obviously it's an era of information we are living in, and we see a lot of disinformation. And we've recently also seen a lot of campaigns about Afghanistan, also about the Taliban, of how brutal and monstrous they are. But it turned out to be opposite, and the videos which were being posted online were mostly not from Afghanistan, and they were from Syria, Libya, Yemen. So how important is this for the Afghan people to understand about disinformation, and how can the Taliban educate their population, their people, about disinformation to get them out of this dilemma?
I think it's important, instead of to preach, to act. It's easy to tell, oh, we're great and this and that, but unfortunately we need facts. We need to show that they're going to be applying fair law, they're going to be having access to women. Also, information is really important. So perhaps creating their own channels to really tell what's happening inside Afghanistan, empower people to tell their stories, their own stories, instead of censoring them or letting somebody else tell their stories, which has been happening, unfortunately, with this misinformation from the outside.
Right, Usman, talking about disinformation, I think this is it is a very major and important thing that we all need to understand. Obviously, now at the grassroots level now, obviously information is accessible to every single person now. A 5-year-old child can know what is happening in Afghanistan now. To control disinformation with respect to the future growth of Afghanistan, how important is that?
It is extremely important. And we have to keep in mind that information warfare is a very big part of the contemporary battlefield. So in terms of this fall of Kabul, there has been so much noise on platforms such as Twitter that is very hard for any unbiased person to form a clear opinion of the reality on the ground. A part of that was that the mainstream media in the West, there was a lack of coverage of the Afghan conflict over the past 20 years. And so because of that, it seems like a shock to many people. Plus, the disinformation makes it very clear to very difficult to create an informed opinion. And so disinformation is a very important thing that has to be stemmed. In Afghanistan, access to the internet is available to about 20% of people, but the other 80% of people that are equally vulnerable to disinformation through other means. And so channelizing clear-cut narratives that promote peace and respect are very important in the modern age. Thank you.
Right, Lisa, now let's talk about how important is going to be education. As Usman also said, 20% of the Afghans have internet access. Now, how important is going to be education for the future Afghan children and the entire population at large?
This is absolutely fundamental. They need to preserve their own professionals like teachers. That's incredibly important, and fund schools and universities and educational programs for the most disadvantaged, the ones that might not have access even to schooling or housing. That's definitely the #1 thing, because that's going to dictate what the future is going to look like for Afghani.
Right, Usman. We earlier talked about natural resources. Now, apart from those, what are the main economic boosters for Afghanistan?
They have an agricultural sector which has not had a lot of investment over the past 60 years. Their main export, legal export, is fruits and nuts, which is a very rudimentary thing. Other than that, but in terms of having human capital and having an export or service-driven export economy, they aren't ready to leap into that immediately. That is where they actually need the most assistance in building the technical expertise to then be able to have a service-driven economy that doesn't just cater to a limited urban population, which is where it stands today. So in terms of the economic architecture, you have very rudimentary things in the legal domain, fruits and nuts and things like that in the agriculture sector, plus resources, extractive things, which once you take out, you've used up. In terms of a sustainable economy, work has not been done in the previous governments on this. The Taliban can start to think about it, but they don't have the capacity to do it alone.
Well, and certainly I'm sure they must be thinking about building that capacity now. Lisa, Camillo, anthropologist, you joined us from Italy. Thank you very much for joining us on Newswire. And Dr. Usman Chohan, Director of the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Thank you for joining us on Newswire today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, away from these scenes, there are millions and millions more children, women and men across the country at the precipice of survival. The foes are disease, disaster and destitution. On the ground, we have a humanitarian crisis of incredible proportions unfolding before our eyes. A crisis that has grown in magnitude and complexity since the Taliban completed their takeover of Afghanistan and entered Kabul. The world must act to avert a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. Now, thank you very much for watching.